In the mid-1980s, one piece of hardware took the video game industry by storm: Nintendo's Family Computer, or as it was known outside of Japan, the Nintendo Entertainment System. Developers around the world were drawn to this hardware, and soon it had a robust library of games covering many genres and niches. Nintendo were not alone in the market though, and their success drew competition. Many ended up being pretenders, but a rival did emerge in the form of Sega, who, like Nintendo, had cut their teeth in the arcade scene. But Sega always seemed to be one step ahead when it came to hardware, and one step behind when it came to figuring out software. Regardless, to stay in the game, they knew they needed to try and appeal to whatever gamers wanted to see. And given the rising success of role-playing games developed in Japan, thanks to the emergence of Dragon Quest on the Famicom, it was clear that their new hardware, the Master System, would need a role-playing game of its very own. Sega's response was bold, and it was called Phantasy Star. Arcades were a phenomenon around the globe for a not insignificant period of time, but they really got into their stride at the end of the 1970s. They provided publishers with an incredible way of generating revenue, as potential consumers congregated to a physical location and were then sucked into spending coin after coin, either due to competition with the game itself, many of which were rigged to inspire further spending, or competition from other players, either due to direct PvP style games or the never-ending pursuit of trying to top the leaderboards. The companies that benefited the most throughout this boon were the likes of Capcom, Taito, Atari, Nintendo, Sega, and Konami. And when it came to the highest grossing spots, they each rotated. In 1979, Space Invaders ruled the roost for Taito, before Pac-Man came onto the scene in 1980 and asserted Namco. Nintendo then rose to the top with Donkey Kong in 1981, before Namco reclaimed pole position with Pole Position in 1982. As arcades then started to become more sophisticated, Sega showed off their prowess, and for large parts of 1983, they held the highest grossing spots on the table arcade side with Champion Baseball and Astron Belt with the cockpit variants. Late 1983 and early 1984 was then all about track and field from Konami. In the US alone, the arcade industry was pulling in just shy of $3 billion a year, around $9.7 billion when adjusted for inflation. But while some creators were more than happy to work on these games, and many were indeed solo efforts, others had aspirations to create games that were much more complex. Games that had rich narratives and slower-paced gameplay that were more thought-provoking, as opposed to demanding incredible fast-twitch reflexes. Those games were still being made, but they were often relegated to personal computers, and the returns were paltry by comparison. Ultima, for example, which was seen as one of the preeminent role-playing games of its time, sold around 20,000 copies in its first 6 months on sale, eventually going on to sell 50,000 copies. Given its retail price of $39.95, this meant the original Ultima only generated $800,000 in its first 6 months on sale, which represented 0.16% of what Pac-Man had generated in arcades during the same time period. So while games like Ultima had an impact on fans across the globe, laying seeds of inspiration for a generation of programmers to come, for several years, major publishers continued to focus on the moneymakers, home consoles, and arcades. In their eyes, role-playing games were obtuse and too difficult for average consumers, especially those that were younger, and given their larger scale, they were deemed too time-consuming to produce, something that was exacerbated when considering the return on investment. They simply required more creative input, such as story, art, and music, and also took longer to playtest. A 30-hour game could easily have a debilitating glitch in the final hour that was simply missed due to how difficult playtesting was back then. Arcade games, by comparison, weren't necessarily designed to be beaten, but even those that had the same goal, to keep players trying and paying, had gameplay that was simpler and more repetitive, requiring less thorough testing. There were also inherent limits to how long players would theoretically spend at an arcade cabinet, and if the player managed to get far enough, many games would infamously hit a kill screen where calculating errors invariably made it impossible to progress any further. Even highly profitable cabinets were susceptible, like Donkey Kong, which became impossible at level 22. There was, of course, a thrill and satisfaction that came from working on these games and seeing the returns they generated. But for those who wanted more, the constant push towards high-octane action experiences was demoralizing. The challenge, however, was that even if these developers were inspired to create something more, like a role-playing game, and pitched solid concepts to their superiors, unless they were working for a niche developer who was supporting PC platforms, they were likely to be flat out denied due to the perceived risk of investing time and money into projects which they believed were unlikely to be commercially successful enough to justify the endeavour. Hironobu Sakaguchi, for example, had been fascinated with RPGs and was able to explore the genre through Cruise Chaser Blasty, which was released in 1986 for the PC-88, PC-98 and Sharp X1. He then created King's Knight for the Famicom, which was dubbed a formation RPG, despite very much being a vertical scrolling shoot-'em-up. Sakaguchi's aspirations to create an RPG remained after the release of King's Knight, but his requests were denied. He was instead tasked with overseeing the production of Tobidaise Dakusen, which was very similar to Space Harrier, and Highway Star, which was very similar to Outrun. It was only once Dragon Quest had released that he was able to try and push forward the idea of an RPG again, but it's not like there was an outpouring of support internally. Square hosted an open forum where every team lead could present a vision for an upcoming game they wanted to make, and staff could then choose which project they wanted to work on. Sakaguchi presented his vision for an RPG at this forum, but he only gained support from 3 people. Koji Okuda, director of Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei, had similar opposition at Tecmo. As a company, their entire reputation was based on their arcade games, and it then evolved into porting those arcade games to home consoles. Tecmo was too reluctant to go against their established niche, something that drove Okuda and others to leave and found Atlus. It was only once Dragon Quest released, was successful, and was then followed up by the even more successful Dragon Quest II that things started to change for these kinds of developers. Enix was a publisher with one foot in the PC world, but thanks to the unique relationship they had with their development partners like Chunsoft, they saw the rising potential of creating a role-playing game for Famicom instead, especially when 2 of our creators, Yuji Naka and Koichi Nakamura, were inspired to make it happen. Drawing upon their experience porting games to the Famicom, the Dragon Quest team cracked the code for programming role-playing games on the console, and even devised a clever password system for saving progress without requiring a battery in the cartridge. They geared their creation at younger audiences and sought to teach players how to play the genre. With innovation and deliberate design, Dragon Quest proved role-playing games could be commercially viable. Dragon Quest II then reaffirmed this notion, selling even more copies despite being markedly harder than the first. It became clear from these 2 releases that role-playing games had untapped potential on home consoles. And just as people eagerly lined up to pour quarters into arcade cabinets to play deliberately hard games, executives took note when people started queuing up on the day of release and even playing truant from school to play a role-playing game. Thus, many other companies pivoted to follow suit, like Square and Atlus. But all of these games were being produced for the Famicom, and Nintendo's biggest competitor in the hardware space started to feel as though they were missing out. Sega Enterprises was effectively formed in 1965 when 3 companies, Service Games of Japan, Nihon Goraku Busan, and Rosen Enterprises, were consolidated into one entity, specializing in coin-operated entertainment machines. Early on, they manufactured jukeboxes and pinball machines and then arcade cabinets, starting with a Pong clone called Pongtron in 1973 and a 2-player maze game called Head On in 1979. When the arcade market's popularity began to cool down around 1983, Sega sought to pivot into home console production as well. They released their first console, the SG-1000 or Mark I, on the 15th of July 1983, the very same day that Nintendo launched their family computer, and a sort of 8-bit arms race ensued. Both consoles cost only around 15,000 yen, the equivalent of $100 at the time, and both companies hoped to leverage audiences they'd garnered in the arcades. Sega even got off to an early lead, selling 160,000 Mark I units in its first year on sale. But Nintendo soon caught up and then became something of a juggernaut. To try and stay competitive, Sega published a revised console in 1984 called the SG-1002, but it did little to change the landscape. So in October of 1985, they launched the Sega Mark III, also known internationally as the Sega Master System. Instead of the Texas Instruments chip used in the SG-1000, the Master System included a new graphics chip designed by Sega themselves, which attempted to reproduce the Sega System 2 architecture used in their arcade cabinets. And the improved console was only slightly more expensive, retailing for just under 17,000 yen. But by this point, Sega were having to contend with something else. When it came to software, both Nintendo and Sega had taken the same initial route, leveraging their own development teams to create compelling first-party software. But as time passed and the Famicom install base grew, Nintendo decided to open their doors to third-party support, spawning an expanded catalogue of diverse games from other companies such as Hudson Soft, Namco, Capcom, and even smaller companies like Square. By 1986, this meant Nintendo's first-party titles accounted for only 11% of the software released during that calendar year. Sega, conversely, were reluctant to work with their competitors from the arcade market, and with 3 console revisions in as many years, plus a motley array of add-on peripherals, there was also a notion that Sega were repeating the same mistakes that had led to the North American console market crash, pumping out too many hardware iterations and not enough quality games to justify them. To compensate, Sega tried to really hit the ground running with the Master System. Their development teams were split into 2 divisions, Research and Development Department 1 focused on arcades, while Research and Development Department 2 was to be focused on consoles. It fell to R&D 2 to support the Master System with launch window games from various genres in an attempt to reach a wider audience, and this resulted in games such as Fantasy Zone, Action Fighter, The Ninja, and Space Harrier. When it launched in North America in September of 1986, the Master System sold 250,000 units by Christmas, but they were up against a Nintendo system that had an install base between 6 to 8 million units in Japan alone. The odds were therefore stacked against Sega, but they tried their best to compete directly with Nintendo on the software front, so whatever Nintendo did that was successful, they tried to answer. In response to Super Mario Bros., this saw the development of their own cute 2D platformer called Alex Kidd in Miracle World. It was designed specifically to rival Mario's colourful world and gameplay, and it did become the system's killer app. Yet, given the Mark III's much smaller market share, it remained a drop in the ocean compared to Nintendo and Mario's success, and Sega kept hunting for the next chance to carve out a bigger niche for themselves. One of the planners on Alex Kidd, Kotaro Hayashida, had been campaigning internally for Sega to make their own role-playing game, even giving presentations to explain the genre and its benefits to colleagues and executives. Like many other people at other companies, his insistence finally paid off after Dragon Quest II proved successful. And even though the game wasn't produced by Nintendo themselves, Sega felt its success warranted closer analysis, and it inspired them to make another game to go head-to-head with an experience possible on the Famicom. For if the Famicom had finally broken the seal and introduced role-playing games into the console market, then Sega had no choice but to respond and compete in that arena as well. Keeping game development for their consoles in-house had hindered Sega's third-party offerings, but it also worked to their advantage. They had cultivated a team of talented developers who had made games across a broad spectrum of genres, and although they had gravitated towards arcade-friendly genres like platforming, sports, racing and side-scrolling action, they were not daunted by anything. Nonetheless, competing directly with Dragon Quest was a tall order, not least because they had raised the bar so high with their first 2 releases. Role-playing games were also everything that arcades were not: slow-paced, system-heavy, and story-focused. The kind of game that could be savoured and approached strategically, instead of a shorter, high-adrenaline experience. If ever Sega would have warranted reaching out to a third party to help develop a game, it would have been this case, where the genre's demands were well outside of their supposedly established wheelhouse. But Sega, still stubbornly, or perhaps out of loyalty and faith to their own teams, opted to use internal resources instead. They polled their teams to see if anyone had ideas that would suit a role-playing game, and a young designer named Cheiki Aoki had exactly what they needed. As luck would have it, Aoki had been quietly brainstorming her own idea for an epic tale for some time, one which blended elements of fantasy and science fiction, had a female protagonist, and spanned 4 planets. Her drafts were so extensive that most of the main dialogue was already written before Sega even decided to go with her idea. Now with concept in hand, Sega's R&D 2 began to assemble the team to bring Aoki's vision to life. and this meant Hayashida got to fulfill his dream of making a role-playing game, taking on the role of planner while also working with Aoki to flesh out the scenario even further. One of Sega's best programmers at the time, Yuji Naka, was also brought on board to handle coding. Having joined Sega in 1984, Naka had been tasked with making a game as part of his training, which led him to create Girl's Garden, a unique action game where a young girl needed to gather flowers, dodge hazards like bees and bears, and traverse maze-like obstacles to win over her crush. Though he was embarrassed by his own code, Sega saw potential and released the game, and Girl's Garden proved to be one of the more outstanding games released on the SG-1000, putting Naka's name on the map. And he was shortly entrusted with the Master System's ports of Space Harrier and Outrun, which had been hits in the arcade. Naka was quite proud of his ability to make these games, which had been developed for more powerful arcade systems, run on home consoles, and he therefore strove to make games for the Master System that would not be feasible on the Famicom. Another member to join the team was an up-and-coming artist called Reiko Kadama, who was recruited to design the characters and 2D maps. After studying graphic design in college, one of her seniors was hired at Sega and then offered to get her a job as well. Kodama wasn't particularly familiar with video games at the time, and she thought she'd be working in the advertising department, but she quickly became intrigued by the game design process. Given a shortage of designers, Sega enlisted her to work on Champion Boxing and Ninja Princess, before assigning her as chief designer on Alex Kidd. This new RPG, though, was a whole different beast, and given the sheer scale of the Mark III's 4MB cartridge, another designer was required alongside Kodama, so Sega assigned a newcomer called Kazuyuki Shibata to design the monsters. He brought with him a love of tabletop RPGs, and used the brass miniatures from them as his inspiration. Miki Moritomo, who had worked on Great Golf for the same system, was then brought on as assistant coordinator, the same official title ultimately assigned to Aoki. Lastly came Tokihito Owabo, commonly referred to as Bo by the team, to compose the music and make the sound effects. His first project for the company was Sega's response to Namco's Xevious Satellite 7, a vertical shoot-'em-up, before creating Alex Kidd's catchy soundtrack. Each of the members who were assigned to the team were proven, but not deeply experienced quite yet. Asking them to pivot into a brand new genre and compete against the biggest game in Japan at the time was therefore a pretty tall task. Energized by the prospect and eager to chart a new course for Sega. With the team selected, they piled into a single office at Sega's headquarters and got to work on planning what would ultimately become Phantasy Star. Aoki's extensive story treatment was used as a base, and the team were enthused because it deviated away from the typical role-playing scenarios that existed at the time. But they also wanted to take things further, so as to approach role-playing games from a new angle. Kodama, in particular, felt strongly that if their game was going to take on Nintendo and Dragon Quest, it would have to be something very distinct and different, thus standing out from the crowd. The genre was, to this point, still very heavily codified in traditional Western fantasy tropes, as shown in games like Dragon Quest or indeed Hyderlight. Outside of RPGs, other types of games drew heavily on the same tropes, like The Legend of Zelda and its sword and sorcery look. Or they delved deep into traditional Japanese culture, like the mysterious Murasame Castle. Science fiction games were popular in action genres like shoot-'em-ups, but blending science fiction with role-playing had not really been explored before, and the team felt Sega could attract a brand new market of gamers by appealing to this combination. But they also decided to deviate in another way by making the main protagonist female, an idea which had been central to Aoki's original treatment. While Dragon Quest II had one female party member, the Princess of Moonbrook, playable heroes in video games had almost exclusively been male to this point, with the earliest exceptions aside from Miss Pac-Man being the Atari 2600 game Wabbit, where a farmer had to stop rabbits from stealing her carrot crops. During Phantasy Star's development, Nintendo did release Metroid, whose protagonist, Samus, was female, but as her identity was concealed by her power armor, there was an assumption that most gamers presumed the character was male by default. Nintendo even leaned into this idea, using misleading pronouns in the manual, and players had to play extremely well to earn the ending where Samus revealed her identity. Given this environment, where female leads were hidden or non-existent, Kodama strongly believed in the idea behind Aoki's protagonist. This was also because Kodama had previously designed the main character for Ninja Princess, an arcade title where the captured princess saved herself. Sega had brought it to the SG-1000 in February of 1986, but when preparing for a wider launch on the Master System later that year, They drastically changed the scenario, making the playable character a generic male ninja. While it's unclear if Kodama was aware that her design was going to be changed in this way, she supported Aoki's idea that the protagonist of Phantasy Star should be female, and designed her to be the kind of character that women could empathise with. And thus, Elise Lansdale was born. Aoki, like many of her colleagues, cited Star Wars as an inspiration, particularly Princess Leia. But where Leia had needed to be rescued in the first Star Wars film, Aoki had a plan for a heroine who saved everyone else instead. In order to bring this character to life, Kodama went through about 10 different design iterations before settling on the right balance between femininity and strength. Outside of the protagonist, like Star Wars, the world of Phantasy Star wasn't designed to be purely shiny, cutting-edge and futuristic, even if it was a work of science fiction. Cities were still set amidst natural regions, but they had stylized egg-shaped buildings and their inhabitants wore futuristic clothing. However, to give players something recognizable, they implemented familiar elements of Western armor into the characters' designs. It was a compromise that could help players adjust to the scenario without giving up on the goal of trying to do something different from what had been established elsewhere. By the same token, they hoped to avoid copying Dragon Quest II's boat by introducing 2 new vehicles, the Ice Digger, which could be used to destroy icebergs and reach new areas on the frozen planet of Dozoris, and the spaceship, which could carry players between planets. Coincidentally, to go further against the grain of Dragon Quest, the Phantasy Star team also decided to go back to the first-person dungeon crawling of Wizardry. While this visual style had served as a source for inspiration for Dragon Quest, there was a lack of games that tried such a mechanic on home consoles, a conclusion that other developers such as Atlus were also coming to at the same time. Sega's team had an ace up their sleeve though, which helped their dungeons stand apart. The Master System had a leg up on the Famicom in terms of raw graphical power, and Yuji Naka experimented with the idea of actually animating the dungeon as players progressed. No other game had truly accomplished this feat at this time. Instead, when players picked their next direction, the screen had to be redrawn, as if to simulate that the characters had taken a couple of steps forward. Depending on the game and the hardware, it was sometimes hard to tell if the character had even moved at all. Naka therefore wanted Phantasy Star to stand out by making it the first game with smooth 3D dungeons, animating the change in perspective and smoothly rotating to the left or right instead of the abrupt transitions in every other Wizardry-like game. This was meant to not only help players navigate the maze, but to show off what the Master System was capable of, while also achieving something that the Famicom could not. And they believed this could be a real difference maker. To this end, Naka first programmed the dungeons as 3D wireframe models. Then, using a program he developed himself specifically for this task, the artists could layer their sprites on top of the wireframes. The experiments worked well, but initially they worked too well. Naka's prototypes scrolled faster, like a roller coaster, so fast in fact that when he showed it to his co-workers, many of them immediately got motion sickness due to how real they perceived it to be. Morimoto compared her physical reaction to being drunkenly dizzy, while others were made nauseous. But having now discovered the phenomenon of 3D motion sickness, Naka retooled the scrolling, working with the artists to trim the number of frames used for the animation, thereby slowing it down and reducing the traumatic effect. It was a meticulous and grueling process, creating individual frames of animation and manually putting them together by trial and error. But even if his colleagues hadn't physically recoiled, Naka would have been forced to alter his experiments anyway. As it turned out, the scrolling technology accounted for 3 megabytes for the cartridge's 4 megabytes of memory, and this left minimal room for the rest of the game. Fortunately, Naka devised a way to compress the data on the cartridge and decompress it as needed during gameplay, which also helped to slow the animation speed down by about 4 to 5 times compared to the original. The first-person dungeons weren't the only visual aspect the team sought to overhaul. They saw another opportunity to make their game stand out by animating monsters. Monsters in role-playing games had come a long way from the simplistic renditions found in the genre's earliest games. PC entries like Ultimate and Wizardry were limited to rendering monsters as stick figures or collections of rudimentary geometric shapes. But game creators were able to get a bit more creative over time, particularly as the genre shifted over to the Famicom. Dragon Quest's monsters popped off the screen, even conveying the artistic style of their designer, Akira Toriyama. But as dynamic as they were still static images, simply plopped onto the screen to stand menacingly, and Sega wanted to make the battle scene much more dynamic. To this end, Phantasy Star's monsters were designed to feature simple animations, each moving in a unique manner when performing attacks. Humanoid enemies swung their weapons, slime monsters bounced closer to the player's perspective, and spiders launched webs. The effect paired well with the more realistic animations of moving through the dungeons, deepening Phantasy Star's immersive tone. However, despite the Master System's capabilities and the size of the cartridge, they weren't able to draw the monsters as huge individual sprites. Instead, they drew the majority of the monsters as background elements and overlaid their moving parts as sprites. Thus, though the monsters appeared to move, it was only the relevant limbs and appendages that were actually animated, while the rest of their bodies remained static. It meant presenting the monsters on a large scale with basic animations gave Phantasy Star a distinct look, but this also demanded a compromise. It wasn't possible, for example, to render multiple enemies on screen at their intended size and have them be animated, so multiple monsters had to be represented by a single sprite. In addition to moving monsters and scrolling corridors, the team also incorporated animations into the overworld. Their goal was to always keep the game animating something, like water lapping against a shore, moving conveyor belt walkways, or unsettling antlion mouths moving in the desert. It was an ambitious target, and they had to scale it back, with animations ultimately being used occasionally for emphasis. Other areas manifested as intended though. So whereas conversing with NPCs in games like Dragon Quest was traditional, with a simple text box appearing to display the conversation, in Phantasy Star, it cut away to distinct scenes, showing the town's personal character as a full-body sprite, as well as the environment around them, like the interior of their home or business. This approach made up for the lack of NPC animations and further added immersion to the world, giving players a closer perspective and making interactions feel meaningful. At certain points in the story, this technique was then applied to party members, showing off their profile sprites to illustrate conversations between them as a sort of rudimentary cutscene. In experimenting with these new narrative techniques, they even attempted staged set-piece battles. At one point, Elise was given the chance to rest at the governor's home before being attacked by a succubus, leading to a boss fight that was made impossible to win. In this regard, Phantasy Star then beat Dragon Quest II, as its programmers at Chunsoft were forced to abandon a similar concept where large illustrations would have highlighted key plot moments. But thanks to the custom graphics chip in the Master System, the team at Sega's R&D 2 division was able to push the technical envelope and truly make Phantasy Star stand out with large, more vibrant and dynamic visuals. Thus, even though it was reminiscent of Wizardry and Dragon Quest II in many ways, having 4 playable characters with specific skill sets, first-person battles and so on, the presentation compensated, making it a more engrossing experience that stood out from the competition on the Famicom and PC alike. The trappings around the gameplay, like interplanetary travel, laser guns and light swords, then made it distinct. But neither the visual presentation, the world or the gameplay would have shone without solid audio design. Similarly to the visual elements, the FM audio chip available as an add-on to the console enabled the envelope to be pushed even further. And this meant Uabo could get more creative with the game's soundtrack. The sound chip added an additional 9 audio channels to the Master System's existing sound chip, which helped Uabo's score compete with the superior sound channels of the Famicom. It also enabled a lot more diversity with the soundtrack, deepening the bass and expanding the range of instruments available. The result was a catchy modern score that stood out from Dragon Quest's classically inspired themes, with a dash of rock and pop influences that suited the science fiction atmosphere. Throughout the process of composing, Uabo often sought input from the wider team, double-checking that he'd captured the right feeling. But this was made relatively straightforward by the small team working in close quarters at Sega's headquarters. Each member of the team was often acutely aware of what the others were doing, and they could easily check in to see how other aspects of the game were coming together. It fostered an environment where each member of the team felt like they had the freedom to do what they wanted, while also closely collaborating with other departments. And this reflected the strong culture of mentorship Sega adopted in the mid-80s, where senior programmers were also available for consulting with junior staff. When problems or dilemmas arose, such as Naka's uber-fast dungeon scrolling, the rest of the team was close at hand to provide input and assistance. But where this teamwork helped most was when issues arose around capacity, a challenge faced by almost every developer. Dragon Quest, for example, had used a 1 MB cartridge, and Square was developing Final Fantasy for a 2 MB cartridge. Phantasy Star was working with a cutting-edge 4 MB capacity, but even still the storage ceiling loomed overhead. Aoki's initial outlines for the game spanned 4 planets, but ultimately, the scenario had to be scaled down to only 3. Still an impressive feat, yet undeniably a compromise from the original vision, which had sparked the whole project. Animations also had to be kept as simple as possible, looped or mirrored to save space, and this led to some occasional awkwardness, like attacks from zombie enemies who looked like they were drooling towards the player and then sucking it back up. But background mirroring also made some of Kodomo's ambitions for lighting and shadows impossible. Kodomo was adamant on the full screen backgrounds though, and was willing to make compromises in other areas to make sure they were kept. Once again, Naka's insight on programming proved vital. After being mentored by arcade legend Yu Suzuki, Naka had come to believe that efficiency of coding was paramount. Hardware specifications alone could not solve a game's problems, but by optimizing their coding practices, programmers could not only make their games run, but run faster. Coincidentally, an incident at a competing studio happened simultaneously and illustrated the difference. Phantasy Star and Square's Final Fantasy were in production at around the same time, both aiming to be released in the same week in December of 1987. But Square's development team encountered a slight yet fundamental snag. Their lead programmer, Nasir Jebeli, was a renowned programmer in his own right before joining the company, and he'd worked on great games like Highway Star, but he had no frame of reference for how role-playing games worked, leading Sakaguchi to have to try and explain fundamental concepts to him like hit points. After they struggled, they had to hire Ken Narita and Kiyoshi Yoshi to take over all battle scene programming as a result, and this led to inefficiencies. At Sega, Naka was able to bring his knowledge of the genre to bear to fix problems quite quickly and efficiently. Towards the end of the project, he went over Phantasy Star's code, trimming, compressing and condensing where he could in order to make everything fit without requiring further cuts. At the very end of development, the cartridge space was so fully accounted for, there wasn't even space for a single image Kodomo hoped to include in the ending, a simple shot of the 4 playable heroes right at the start of the credits. Seeing how disappointed she was, Naka went through the entire code and managed to free up just enough space to fit that one image. But this wasn't Naka's only contribution. He also came up with the name. Of all the things that she had planned, Aoki had never come up with a title for the scenario she'd created. Naka, though, was infatuated at the time with a certain song called Nagasa no Fantasy, or Beachside Fantasy, by an idol named Noriko Sakai. Using the word fantasy as a base, he experimented with different titles before settling on a name that told players this role-playing game was different. A different take on fantasy, rooted in science fiction. Thus, Phantasy Star. For Sega's ambitious new take on role-playing games, vulnerabilities became assets. 2 major competitors, Final Fantasy and a third Dragon Quest, were in the spotlight for Famicom owners at the end of 1987, and RPG fans were eating well, with other offerings from Atlus, Hudson Soft and Nihon Falcom arriving in the latter half of the year as well. But for Sega players eager for a taste of the genre, there was only one stop in town: Phantasy Star. For those who had chosen to invest in Sega's Master System, the hype for the various role-playing games on Nintendo's Famicom now had a cure. And within Sega's market, Phantasy Star had no other competition, giving it even more attention than other Sega exclusives. That being said, Sega's market share was still incredibly small, only about 10% of Japan's domestic console sales, so Phantasy Star was preparing to leap into a much shallower pool. But Sega hoped this new game would help to entice more people to buy into the Master System. They boasted in advertising that they had further refined the genre, with miraculous graphics, emphasizing the cartridge size and the FM sounds. The game's protagonist was front and center in magazine ads, though Phantasy Star often shared these pages with Afterburner, another prominent Sega game with a large capacity cartridge. Famitsu, the biggest gaming publication in Japan, was predominantly focused on Nintendo, but sang Phantasy Star's praises in their small Master System section, highlighting specifically how the enlarged scale had enhanced the storytelling. And instead of the magazine's traditional 4-writer review, the Master System column's writer simply gave Phantasy Star an enthusiastic 9 out of 10. Once Phantasy Star did go on sale, it didn't muster the same kind of newsworthy headlines as a Dragon Quest game, but Sega's loyal fanbase mobilized nonetheless. Despite debuting in Japan on the 20th of December, it saw Phantasy Star sell 38,000 units before the end of the year, and its momentum carried through to the early months of 1988, with it going on to sell around 262,000 copies in total. Sega's sales seemed like a drop in the ocean, but for a game on the Master System, it was a sweeping success. Nintendo's hardware numbers were on another level entirely, so while Dragon Quest sold more copies in total, it reached a smaller sample of the total Famicom audience. Hayashida and others at Sega always knew they were fighting an uphill battle, but at the time, in Japan, the Master System only had an install base of around 1 million, so Phantasy Star had an attach rate of about 25%, an incredible feat for a game that arrived so late in a hardware generation. This also meant Phantasy Star ended up as the third best-selling game to launch on the system, beating out the likes of Outrun, Afterburner and Space Harrier 3D. Unfortunately, there was no major shift in console sales, but Phantasy Star proved popular with those who took the chance on it. The official strategy guide even had to see numerous reprints, demonstrating that fans were eager to explore its depths even though the light of the Master System was fading. Beyond Japan though, Phantasy Star had an even bigger impact. Sega, unlike most of its competitors in the role-playing market, wasted no time in localizing their grand adventure for English audiences, and this was in spite of it being a big, scary role-playing game with lots of text. Nintendo had often put off localizing the genre for this very reason, with ports taking years. But Sega managed to turn around an English localized port of Phantasy Star in less than a year, and they managed to launch it in November of 1988 in not just the North American market, but in Europe too. This made Phantasy Star one of, if not the earliest proper role-playing game produced in Japan to be released for English audiences, introducing Western gamers to a new offshoot genre and beating the likes of Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy by a year or more. The closest thing to an RPG that console players in these markets had seen thus far was Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda, localized in 1987. But this then introduced another question. Since it was a trailblazer, they wondered who would actually buy it, not least because of the price point. Phantasy Star's 4MB cartridge had a steep price tag, costing £40 in the UK, half the cost of the Master System itself, and the price in the US was even steeper, ranging from $60 to $80. It meant that sometimes Phantasy Star cost more than the console itself when it went on sale. But despite the price tag, the English version was also somewhat diminished from the Japanese original, as the FM sound chip was sacrificed to make room for the translated text. Thus, Sega sought to sweeten the deal by including extras in the box, such as a full strategy guide. The price, though, did prove to be prohibitive, and sales weren't as high as expected. But sales numbers didn't reflect how much the game itself was enjoyed by the people who did actually play it. Western critics were intrigued, and Phantasy Star received near-perfect scores from various Sega-themed publications. Computer and Video Game Magazine, a more generalist publication, also scored it as a 75%, praising the graphics and playability, but lamenting the sound quality and decrying the price tag. When Electronic Gaming Monthly debuted the following year, Phantasy Star ranked number 2 on their top 10 list, hailed as a new breed of adventure game that could set the standard for future role-playing titles. Phantasy Star was later awarded EGM's Best Graphics Award in their annual awards in 1988. Perhaps more poignantly, Phantasy Star also set the tone for Japanese RPGs with critics, and when Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy did eventually cross over and launch in that market, they faced much harsher criticism from Western media, who expected the same large-scale graphics and animated sprites. Sega may have ultimately lost the sales war in the West, but they didn't go out without a fight, making it a bit harder for the competition in the process. Due to the success of Phantasy Star relative to the Master System's install base, Sega decided they should try and build on this new IP, as it stood out amongst a sea of well-known arcade hits as one of the jewels in their crown. The main difference here was that, whereas most of their other games had no real story, and thus the lasting appeal and expansion possibilities to other mediums were quite limited, Phantasy Star had lore that players could really latch onto, and they genuinely wanted more. To take advantage of this, Sega worked with Futabasha to reimagine the plot as Phantasy Star Alyssa's Adventure, and it became part of a wildly popular series of choose-your-own-adventure style gamebooks. Here, unlike the game where the narrative was largely predetermined, readers could make their own decisions, providing much more agency in terms of how the narrative played out. Some years later, Sega then released the soundtrack, but it wasn't a standalone offering. Sega had been publishing music for their games for some time at this point, with Sega Game Music Volume 1 releasing on the 21st of December 1986. It contained music from some of their biggest hits like Outrun, Space Harrier, and Alex Kidd. And Volume 2, which was released a few months later, had music from Fantasy Zone, Hang On, Enduro Racer, and Quartet. Volume 3 then arrived towards the end of the year and contained music from Afterburner, Alien Syndrome, Super Hang On SDI and Dunkshot, and it set the stage for Phantasy Star to appear in Volume 4. But there was no Volume 4. Sega instead shifted to a new series called GSM, and the first volume, which was released in July of 1988, included music from games such as Alter Beast and Thunderblade, but not Phantasy Star. Volume 2, which was released at the end of that year, was called Power Drift and Mega Drive GSM Sega 2. It did feature music from the Phantasy Star series, but focus was now on the second entry, which had launched on the Mega Drive. It meant fans of the original had to wait until 1993 to hear music from that game via another medium, and it was delivered via the Phantasy Star Collection. Disc 1 contained just 3 tracks, and each track had a back-to-back playthrough of each piece from that respective game. Phantasy Star clocked in at just over 14 minutes of specific music across 19 tracks. Disc 2 then featured purposeful arrangements from Takanobu Masada, a composer who had worked on the soundtracks for anime such as Dragon's Heaven and Sonic Soldier Borgman. Over the next few hardware generations, Phantasy Star was then often remastered and sold in compilations, first featuring on the Sega Saturn as part of the Phantasy Star collection, and then, after Sega ceased making their own hardware, on the Game Boy Advance and PlayStation 2. More recently, Phantasy Star appeared on the Nintendo Switch in 2018 via a port developed under the Sega Ages imprint. Kodama herself oversaw the initiative as a producer, and it served to be one of her final games before she passed in 2022. Perhaps greater than the sales figures or critic scores though, Phantasy Star proved to be more than just the start of a new franchise. It was a watershed moment for Sega as a developer and publisher, representing a major opportunity for its developers to prove themselves in the face of a shifting home console landscape. And it was perhaps because of this that its key staff largely went on to be influential names at Sega, working on the Phantasy Star series and beyond. But without the company's willingness to give them a chance to do something which no one else had done before, the landscape of the role-playing genre and video games as a whole might well have been very different. But with that, thank you so much for watching, everyone. My name is Darryl, and together with Chris and Colin, we hope you've enjoyed listening to the incredible development history of the original Phantasy Star. Hopefully, as you watched through the video, you found some interesting nuggets of information that perhaps you didn't know before. And if you did, then please consider showing us how much you appreciate the effort that's put into researching, writing and editing this kind of video by giving it a like. And it needs to be said that because we're still a new channel, any interactions you make will really help out. We're also very thankful for the support we receive on Patreon. Patreon supporters get access to history videos like this one as early as possible. So if you sign up now, you'll soon be able to get access to the next episode in the series, which is focused on Dragon Quest III, as well as a full-length bonus episode that's Patreon exclusive that's all about Hydralide. You can find out more at patreon.com/datalog. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more RPG goodness.